The snow fell like frozen tears from the dark December sky, blanketing the city streets in a cruel blanket of white. Most people hurried past the small figure huddled near the subway entrance, their designer coats and expensive boots carrying them quickly toward warm homes and holiday dinners. But one man stopped, and that single moment of pause would change 3 lives forever. Marcus Chen had everything the world told him mattered. At 35, he was the youngest CEO in his company's history, commanding a financial empire from the 63rd floor of a glass tower that pierced the clouds. His suits cost more than most people earned in a month. His watch could have fed a family for a year. He lived in a world of quarterly reports, hostile takeovers, and corporate warfare where weakness was death and compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford. His own father had taught him that lesson well, raising him with an iron fist and a colder heart, turning a sensitive boy into a calculating machine. Marcus had learned to bury his emotions so deep that sometimes he wondered if they existed at all anymore. Tonight, like most nights, he was leaving the office long after his employees had gone home to their families. Christmas was just another day on the calendar, another opportunity for profit margins and strategic planning. He was thinking about the merger proposal on his desk, calculating numbers in his head as his driver waited at the curb, when he heard the voice. It was small and trembling, barely audible above the wind. "Sir, please. My baby sister is freezing." Marcus almost kept walking. Every executive knew the statistics about street scams, about people who preyed on compassion. His father's voice echoed in his mind, harsh and dismissive. "Never stop for anyone. They're all looking for a handout. You worked for what you have." But something made him turn. Perhaps it was the genuine terror in that young voice. Perhaps it was the way the words cracked with desperation rather than rehearsed manipulation. Or perhaps, buried beneath 15 years of carefully constructed armor, some small part of the boy he used to be still remembered what it felt like to be helpless and afraid. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His clothes were threadbare and soaked through from the snow, his lips tinged blue beneath the flickering streetlight. In his arms, he clutched a bundle of blankets, and from within those ragged layers came the weak cry of an infant. The boy's eyes, huge and dark and swimming with unshed tears, looked up at Marcus with a mixture of hope and fear, as if he expected to be kicked aside like trash on the sidewalk. Marcus found himself kneeling in the snow, his $1,000 suit forgotten. When he pulled back the corner of the blanket, his breath caught in his throat. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old, her tiny face pale and still, her breathing shallow and labored. Her lips were turning blue. This wasn't a scam. This was a child dying in front of him. Everything his father taught him, everything he'd built his empire on, suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless in the face of those 2 small lives trembling in the winter night. Without thinking, Marcus stripped off his cashmere coat and wrapped it around both children, pulling them close to his chest. The boy gasped at the sudden warmth, his small body shaking violently as he began to sob. How long had he been out here, protecting his sister, waiting for someone to care? Marcus's driver started to protest as he opened the car door and guided the children inside, but one look at his employer's face silenced him. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Marcus's carefully ordered world. He barked orders into his phone, calling his personal physician, his housekeeper, anyone who could help. His penthouse apartment, usually a sterile showcase of wealth and success, suddenly needed to become a haven. The boy's name was Daniel, and the baby was Emma. In the warmth of the car, with hot air blasting from the vents and Marcus's coat still wrapped around them, Daniel's story spilled out in broken fragments. Their mother had died 3 months ago, an overdose in a shelter bathroom. Their father had disappeared years before Daniel was even born. They'd been placed in foster care, but the system was overwhelmed and underfunded. Daniel had been separated from Emma, sent to a home where the other children were cruel and the adults were indifferent. When he learned that Emma was sick and her foster family wasn't taking her to the doctor because they couldn't afford it, Daniel had done the only thing his 8-year-old mind could conceive. He'd run away, taken his sister, and tried to care for her himself. For 2 weeks, they'd survived on the streets. Daniel had begged for money, stolen food from convenience stores, and wrapped Emma in every scrap of cloth he could find. But tonight, with the temperature dropping and Emma's breathing growing weaker, he'd finally broken. He'd started asking strangers for help, desperately hoping someone would see them as human beings worth saving. Marcus listened to this story, and something inside him that had been frozen for 15 years began to crack. He saw himself in Daniel's fierce protectiveness, remembered the scared little boy he'd once been before his father's cruelty had taught him to feel nothing. He remembered holding his own baby sister once, before she'd been taken away by social services because their father couldn't stop drinking. He'd been 9 years old, and he'd promised her he'd come back for her. But by the time he'd made his fortune, it was too late. She'd died in a car accident at 16, and he'd never even gotten to say goodbye. That night, Marcus's penthouse transformed into a makeshift hospital. His physician confirmed that Emma had pneumonia and severe malnutrition, but with proper care, she would survive. Daniel was hypothermic and dehydrated, his small body pushed beyond its limits by fear and determination. Marcus watched as his staff, people he'd barely spoken to outside of terse instructions, worked through the night to help these children. His housekeeper, Maria, held Emma and sang to her in Spanish. His driver made endless runs for medicine and supplies. Even his executive assistant, stern and professional, showed up at midnight with armfuls of children's clothes and toys. In the days that followed, Marcus's carefully constructed world continued to unravel. He took time off work for the first time in a decade, spending hours with Daniel and Emma, learning their rhythms and needs. He hired the best social workers and lawyers money could buy, navigating the complex foster system he'd never known existed. He visited the homes Daniel described, seeing for himself the overwhelmed, underpaid workers trying to care for too many children with too few resources. Daniel didn't trust easily. The world had taught him that adults made promises they didn't keep, that today's kindness might become tomorrow's cruelty. But slowly, as days turned into weeks, he began to believe that Marcus might be different. He started to smile, tentatively at first, when Marcus read him stories at bedtime. He began to relax when Marcus assured him that Emma was safe, that no one would take her away. Marcus discovered something profound in those quiet moments. The ruthless efficiency that had built his empire meant nothing compared to the weight of a small hand trusting him to hold it. The victories he'd celebrated in boardrooms paled beside the sound of Emma's laughter when he made silly faces. The respect he'd commanded through fear couldn't match the warmth of Daniel calling him by name instead of sir. His board of directors thought he'd lost his mind. His competitors smelled blood in the water, sensing weakness in his distraction. His father, still alive and bitter in a nursing home Marcus paid for but never visited, called him a fool when Marcus finally went to see him. "You're throwing away everything I taught you for some street urchins," the old man sneered. "You're weak, just like I always feared." Marcus looked at his father, this man who'd shaped him through cruelty and taught him that love was vulnerability, and felt only pity. "You didn't teach me everything," he said quietly. "You taught me how to succeed. But these children are teaching me why it matters." The legal process was grueling. The foster system didn't want to release the children to a single man with no parenting experience, no matter how wealthy. There were home visits and psychological evaluations, background checks and court hearings. Marcus, who'd never failed at anything he set his mind to, discovered that money couldn't simply bulldoze through bureaucracy designed to protect vulnerable children. He had to prove himself worthy, not with his bank account but with his commitment and his heart. Daniel testified in family court, his small voice steady as he told the judge that Marcus had saved them, that he felt safe for the first time in his life, that Emma smiled now and ate well and didn't cry all night anymore. The boy's courage, standing up in front of strangers to fight for the family they'd become, broke something open in Marcus's chest that had been locked away for decades. On a spring morning 6 months after that snowy night, Marcus stood in a courthouse with Daniel holding one hand and Emma babbling happily in his other arm. The judge signed the papers that made them legally his children, a family bound not by blood but by choice and love. Marcus, who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without his hands shaking, wept openly as he held his son and daughter close. His life was unrecognizable now. The penthouse had been traded for a real home in a neighborhood with good schools and parks. His hours were still long, but they ended in time for dinner and bedtime stories. He taught Daniel to ride a bike in the park where he'd once jogged alone, checking stock prices on his phone. He attended Emma's checkups and Daniel's parent-teacher conferences with the same intensity he'd once brought to board meetings. His company actually thrived under his new leadership style, as the empathy he'd rediscovered made him a better judge of character and a more inspiring leader. But more than his circumstances had changed. Marcus himself was transformed. The calculating machine his father had created had remembered how to be human. The CEO who'd seen people as resources or obstacles now saw them as stories, as struggles, as beings deserving of dignity and compassion. He established a foundation to reform foster care, hiring people who understood the system's failures from the inside. He created a program at his company to hire former foster youth, giving them not just jobs but mentorship and support. He became a voice for the vulnerable, using his platform and wealth in ways his younger self would never have imagined. Daniel grew into a confident young man, still protective of his sister but no longer carrying the weight of the world on his small shoulders. He excelled in school, pursued his dream of becoming a doctor, and never forgot what it felt like to be invisible on a cold street corner. Emma, who'd been dying that winter night, blossomed into a bright and joyful child who knew nothing of those dark early months except through the stories her father and brother told her. Years later, Marcus would return to that subway entrance on snowy December nights, not as the man who almost walked past, but as the father who understood what almost wasn't. He'd stand there remembering the small voice that had broken through his armor, the trust in frightened eyes that had given him a chance to become someone better than he'd been. He'd think about all the people who'd walked past Daniel that night, all the chances for compassion that went unseized, and he'd feel grateful beyond measure that something had made him stop. The story of the CEO who rescued 2 children became something of a legend, but Marcus knew the truth was more complicated. Yes, he'd saved Daniel and Emma that night, given them shelter and food and warmth. But they'd saved him too, rescued him from a half-life of achievement without meaning, success without joy. They'd given him the family his father's cruelty had stolen, the chance to be the parent he'd needed and never had. They'd taught him that strength wasn't about building walls around your heart but about having the courage to tear them down. So if you're watching this story and feeling moved, don't just hit that like button and subscribe, though I hope you will. Do something more. Look around your own life for the moments when you have the choice to stop or keep walking, to see someone's humanity or look away. You don't have to be a CEO to change a life. You just have to be willing to pause, to listen, to care when it would be easier not to. Because sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back, and the greatest success isn't measured in profits or power but in the love we give and the lives we touch along the way. The warmth we offer others has a way of healing the cold places in our own hearts. And that, more than any achievement or acquisition, is what makes a life truly worth living.